on this one, Dr. Lawrence?
Ms. Cooksey?
Not so much a staff report per se. I just wanted to be able to answer questions if you all had any of them, and to remind you all what the caveats are of the staff's recommendation. There are some conditions to our recommending that the Clayton Valley High School be able to use the radio station and the classroom for the upcoming school year. And the first caveat is that there is an appropriately credentialed instructor with at least 2 years of broadcast experience that is hired to teach the class, that all students receive 6 2-hour sessions in radio station operation training and FCC non-commercial operation training aligned with the ROP curriculum. And this is really important because whatever happens with the station, whether it's a sale or a lease, or whether we continue to own it, unless the students who are using it and on air know how to properly conduct themselves in accordance with the FCC rules for non-commercial stations, it tarnishes the brand that these folks have just talked about, have worked so hard over 40 years to help build. So we want to maintain that. The third caveat is that all students must be consistently monitored by an appropriately credentialed instructor while they're at the broadcast studio and while they're on air. And then the fourth criteria is that Melissa Foster Wilson or someone who is properly credentialed remain as a consultant to the district to operate the radio station for the broadcast programming and for the FCC requirements so that the station does not go dark. Are there questions from the board?
I have a question. These caveats, are they, is this always, everything's been done like this? They've always required the broadcast experience of a credential instructor and all these other things? Is this part of the ROP program and you're just asking for the same thing, or is it changing it somehow?
This is not changing. This is part of the ROP program that we used to operate. Students would have training in FCC, non-commercial. We'd always have a teacher that was fully credentialed. They would always be monitored when they're on the air. And so we're merely asking that if Clayton Valley Charter High School is going to do an ROP program where they're using the actual radio and the airtime, that they do what is required.
So I have a couple of questions. Hopefully, I don't know that this will, I do not believe this will occur, but I just want to understand it. If there is anything inappropriately done on the air and we receive fines or penalties from the FCC, who is responsible for the payment of those fines and penalties?
We, as a district and the owner of that license, are responsible for the fines and penalty, which is why we have to be so careful with the conditions that we put in place. And if we are penalized in any way as a district, in my mind, that would be grounds for rescinding any kind of agreement with the charter school for the radio station. So what would happen is if you all approve that they're allowed to use this, we would have to do a separate small use agreement, and we would spell out that any fines that accrue to the district would result in the revocation of the use for this year.
Okay, and then the second one is, a couple of comments I had was about earning money for the station. Since this is, I believe I read, a non-commercial station, how would we be, I'm assuming that there is no way that we could be asking for funds and things through this.
You could still have people give donations, just like now people could donate to the school if they wanted to. People could donate to the radio station. I don't recommend that people get on air and ask for a donation, but you could do that and you could not run afoul of the FCC violations if you do it correctly. I'm not a radio expert. I'd have to look into what the requirements are to stay within the FCC rules, but it is true that you can raise money by asking for donations.
Well, don't you have some on-air sales, advertising and things that raise some revenue?
I don't actually know that. I'm sorry.
Well, it says non-commercial station, so I'm assuming that means it's no commercials, but I don't know, so then I think I need to understand what is non-commercial station. meaning that it's not a commercial versus, I mean, it's not a commercial station like a KGO versus it's being able to run. And then I guess if they're allowed to sell airtime, who receives the fund? Is it, since it's our license, do we receive the funding for it, or does Clayton Valley Charter receive the funds?
So because we're non-commercial, we're not actually selling anything. We're not putting people on the air and advertising for them in return for payment, because that would violate the non-commercial. The difference between a non-commercial radio station and one that's for profit is that we are a we're a public entity, and so we can't raise money. We can't go out and solicit donations and use them and charge people to raise money. That's not what we can do. We can't say, if you want to be on the radio station, we'll sell you some airtime for $5,000. That's not what we're allowed to do under this FCC broadcast license. I do know that much.
Thank you. Board members, any other questions?
So if the station were to receive donations and the students from Clayton Valley High School are operating the station, how would the funds go strictly to the station, and what would, to the program at Clayton Valley High School? And how, are there any parameters on how they expend the funds? Are they used for teacher stipends? Are they used for equipment? Is it to offset costs, particular costs, or equipment replacement? Are there any parameters around those sorts of things?
How they raise funds and what those funds can be used for depends on what they say to people when they go out to raise the funds. So, for instance, if they were to say, we want volunteers or we want donations to help pay teacher salaries, if people donate directly to the charter in order to do that, that's the way they can use the funds. So we, as the owners of the license and allowing people to use it, what we do is we put a caveat on the things that they can do. And what they can do is just operate within the broadcast requirements of the FCC for non-commercial. Other than that, we can't put any restrictions, or I'm not recommending that we put any restrictions on how they use the property. They're going to be using this, is my understanding, just as ROP would be used in any other sense. And if that is the case, ROP is pretty strict about what you can and cannot do as far as a non-commercial license.
And then I have a question around the broadcast time that typically happens during our board meetings on Monday night. Will that continue as it has in the past?
I've talked with Ms. Foster Wilson, and she or student volunteers will make sure that they are broadcasting our board meetings. Is that what your question is?
Yes. And then the final comment that I will make is that I've had contact from various members of our community, and they view, while the station is at Clayton Valley High School, they view it as an asset for the entire district. So I would just like to share that piece of information, that while depending on the outcome of our decision tonight, that there is a community sense of ownership across the entire district for this station. Not that it belongs just to Clayton Valley High School.
And that's so important to underscore. And I think the other thing that's important to underscore is you all own that radio station, meaning the district, and you all entrust for this district. So even though you allow Clayton Valley to use the station to operate an ROP program, the radio stations, the music that plays, and the editorial content of the radio station when it's not being used for ROP and teaching students, that is run by Ms. Foster Wilson, and she's still doing that. So I think we just need to make sure that people understand, by you all agreeing to do this, it's not as if there's not going to be any district control over music and other things that happen on that station. ROP uses that for a limited portion of time during the day to teach students.
If I could just ask a couple questions too, Ms. Cooksey. Who initiated the sale of this? Did KQED approach the district?
You know, it was so odd. KQED approached us right at the time when we were trying to make a decision. And I want to say it was late May, I had intended to come to the board and make a recommendation, and I was having trouble finding somebody to help value the station. And it seemed very odd that I get this call from Joanne Wallace at KQED, and she said she talked to a former radio student at